Harlem had seen Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walk through danger so often that people believed nothing could shake him. He had survived prison, violence, betrayal, and years of pressure that broke other men. But the night the humiliation happened was different. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't whispered behind closed doors. It happened in public, under bright lights, in front of a crowd large enough to turn one moment into a story that would never die. This was the kind of night Harlem remembered forever. The place was packed. Music filled the room, mixing with the smell of sweat, perfume, and heat trapped under the ceiling. Men wore their best suits, trying to look important. Women moved with confidence, dressed not just to be seen, but to remind the world they had pride. Events like this mattered in Harlem. They were proof that joy still existed in a city that was constantly told to stay quiet and know its place. But power has a way of entering spaces where it doesn't belong. He arrived late, and everyone noticed. That was the first warning. Late arrivals weren't accidents. They were statements. They said one thing clearly: time bends for the people who believe they own it. His name was Carlo Moretti, known on the streets as Red Hands. He wasn't the biggest boss in New York, but he was protected by men who mattered. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who rarely faced consequences. Moretti didn't come to enjoy the night. He came to take something. Bumpy was already inside when Moretti entered, standing calm, watching. He wasn't there to be admired. He never was. He was there because crowded rooms needed someone alert, someone who understood how fast celebration could turn into chaos. Bumpy noticed Moretti immediately, and in that instant, he understood exactly what was about to happen. Moretti moved through the crowd like it was obligated to move for him. People stepped aside without thinking, not because they respected him, but because fear had trained them well. Harlem had learned over generations that certain men brought problems that didn't end cleanly. When Moretti reached the center of the room, he didn't greet anyone. He didn't acknowledge the organizers. He simply looked around, slow and deliberate, like he was choosing his moment. Then his eyes settled on Bumpy. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Just two men standing in the same space. But humiliation doesn't need speed. It needs witnesses. Moretti stepped closer, moving slowly, so the room could feel it. Conversations stopped. Music faded into the background. People leaned in without realizing it, pulled by the sense that something important and dangerous was about to unfold. Bumpy didn't move. His calm wasn't weakness. It was control. He understood the trap. React too fast, and you look reckless. Do nothing, and you look small. The crowd would remember either version forever. Moretti chose his move carefully. He reached out and adjusted Bumpy's suit jacket. Not roughly, not violently. The way a man touches another man when he believes he owns him. It was quiet, clean, and cruel. No punch, no shouting, just a message delivered clearly. I can touch you here, in your own neighborhood, and nothing will happen. Then came the part that froze the room. Moretti placed a folded bill into Bumpy's chest pocket. A tip, a handout, charity. The meaning was impossible to misunderstand. It said Bumpy worked beneath him. It said Harlem belonged to someone else. It said power had a color, and this room was being reminded of it. No one spoke. That silence was louder than any insult. People weren't just watching a man being disrespected. They were watching what it meant for all of them. If Bumpy Johnson, someone they believed untouchable, could be humiliated like this in front of hundreds of people, then what protection did anyone else really have? Bumpy still didn't react. His hands stayed relaxed. His face stayed unreadable. But his stillness didn't feel like surrender. It felt like a man counting. Moretti smiled, satisfied. He believed the moment was over. He believed the story would travel exactly the way he wanted it to. He believed Bumpy had been forced to swallow the insult, but Bumpy hadn't missed anything. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and removed the folded bill. He held it where everyone could see it. Not angrily, not dramatically, just long enough for the humiliation to become undeniable. Then he folded it neatly and placed it into his own coat pocket. Not like he accepted it, like he saved it. That single action changed the air in the room. It told everyone watching that Bumpy understood exactly what had been done, that nothing had been forgotten, that this moment wasn't over, it was being recorded. Moretti turned away, still smiling, confident he had won. He thought the danger had passed. He thought the night would end with laughter and music. But Bumpy's face didn't show anger. It showed certainty. Because in Bumpy Johnson's world, humiliation wasn't something you survived and moved on from. It was something you answered in a way so complete that the man who caused it would wish the crowd had never been there to see it begin. Before Carlo Moretti even reached his car that night, Bumpy had already decided how the humiliation would be repaid, and it would be done quietly, carefully, and in a way that left no room for forgiveness. After the humiliation, after the folded bill was placed like an insult meant to live forever, Bumpy did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He did not follow the Italian mob boss outside. He didn't even stay long enough for people to read his face. He simply turned, nodded once to no one in particular, and walked out of the hall like the night no longer deserved his attention. That walk mattered. In Harlem, men who were humiliated publicly usually reacted one of two ways. They exploded and died fast, or they swallowed it and lived small forever. Bumpy chose neither. And that choice made everyone uncomfortable, especially the people who thought they had just broken him. Outside, the streetlights buzzed softly. Cars passed. Life continued. But something invisible had shifted. Men who had witnessed the insult stood frozen for a moment after Bumpy left, unsure if they were allowed to breathe again. The music resumed, but it sounded wrong now. Too loud, too forced, like laughter after a funeral. Carlo Moretti enjoyed the first few minutes. He liked how the crowd looked confused. He liked how nobody challenged him. He mistook silence for victory. Men like him always do. He shook hands, accepted nods, and let the story begin to form in his head. By morning, people would be talking about how Bumpy Johnson had been checked. By the end of the week, that story would reach Italian ears, and his status would rise. That's what he believed. What he didn't understand was how Harlem processed moments like this. Harlem didn't forget insults. It archived them, quietly, carefully. And once archived, they were never lost. Bumpy didn't go home that night. He walked, block by block, street by street. He watched faces. He listened to footsteps. He noticed who stayed outside late and who suddenly went indoors. Fear leaves patterns, and Bumpy had spent a lifetime reading them. The humiliation wasn't just his problem now. It had infected the neighborhood. Because when a powerful outsider can humiliate Harlem's most feared protector in public, it tells everyone else that the neighborhood is open season. That could not be allowed to stand. But Bumpy also knew something else. Violence would give the city what it wanted. Police, raids, headlines, excuses, a chance to remind Harlem who controlled force. That was why Moretti had chosen a public stage. He wanted Bumpy emotional. He wanted him sloppy. He wanted him criminal on record. So Bumpy did the opposite. He went quiet. The next morning, nothing happened. No retaliation. No rumors. No bodies. That silence confused people. Confusion turned into discomfort. Discomfort turned into fear. Because when powerful men don't respond right away, it usually means something worse is coming. By the second day, small changes began to appear. So small that most people wouldn't notice them, but men like Moretti did. A familiar club suddenly had no table available. Not because it was full, but because the manager claimed there was a private issue. A delivery arrived late. A phone call didn't get returned. A favor that used to be automatic now came with hesitation. These weren't accidents. They were signals. Moretti felt it first as irritation. He snapped at people. He made calls louder than usual. He reminded men who he was. That only made things worse. Because power that has to announce itself is already leaking. By midweek, the irritation turned into concern. He noticed people avoiding eye contact. He noticed conversations stopping when he entered rooms. He noticed that the respect he expected was being replaced with something colder. Distance. Meanwhile, Harlem was watching something else. They were watching Bumpy remain untouched. No arrests, no harassment, no sudden police pressure. That was unusual. Normally, after a public incident, the system reacted fast. This time, nothing happened, and that told Harlem something important. Bumpy was still in control. Women spoke about it quietly while shopping. Men mentioned it casually while leaning on railings, not praising him, just acknowledging reality. The insult hadn't reduced him. It had activated something. The emotional weight of the humiliation began to shift. At first, it had belonged to Bumpy. Now it was migrating. People started to look at Moretti differently, not as a conqueror, as a man who had made a mistake he didn't yet understand. Moretti began sleeping poorly. He replayed the moment in his head, the stillness, the calm, the way Bumpy folded the bill instead of rejecting it. That detail bothered him more than any threat would have. Men who lose control show it immediately. Men who plan do not. He tried to reassure himself. Italians had power. Police looked the other way. Harlem always paid the price eventually. But reassurance only works when reality supports it. And reality was changing. Bumpy was not building rage. He was building agreement. Shop owners adjusted habits. Doors closed earlier. Information traveled faster. Strangers were noticed. Harlem wasn't preparing for a fight. It was preparing to isolate. And isolation is deadly to men who depend on access. By the end of the week, Moretti realized something terrifying. The humiliation had not weakened Bumpy Johnson. It had revealed him. It showed who still stood with him. It showed who waited for instructions. It showed who would move when the time came. And worst of all, it showed that Bumpy did not need to shout to be obeyed. The city still looked normal. Traffic flowed. Music played. People worked. But underneath that surface, something had hardened. Harlem had decided that whatever came next would not be negotiated publicly. Moretti felt the pressure closing in, not from threats, but from absence. Absence of comfort, absence of certainty, absence of safety. He began asking questions he should have asked earlier. Who really controlled Harlem? Who actually decided when things stopped working? And what exactly had Bumpy collected when he pocketed that folded bill? By the time Moretti understood that the humiliation had been turned into leverage, it was already too late to undo it. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't walk away to recover. He walked away to prepare. What Bumpy set in motion after that night would not humiliate Moretti back. It would erase the life he thought was untouchable, piece by piece, without a single public confrontation. The fear didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces, spread across Harlem like a slow shadow that kept lengthening as the days passed. After Bumpy walked away from the humiliation, the neighborhood didn't erupt. It adjusted, and that adjustment was the part outsiders never understood. Harlem had learned long ago that loud reactions invited loud punishment. Survival lived in quieter choices. Those choices began stacking. A shop that used to welcome Italian money stopped extending credit. A driver who once rushed deliveries took longer routes and arrived late with excuses that sounded rehearsed. A back room that used to feel safe now felt exposed, as if walls had learned how to listen. Nothing was openly hostile. Everything was simply less comfortable. And discomfort is where power starts to bleed. Bumpy remained unseen. That was deliberate. He didn't make rounds. He didn't host meetings. He didn't send messages that could be repeated out of context. He let the city do what it already knew how to do when left alone. Protect itself by reducing access to those who threatened it. The humiliation had tested whether Harlem would fracture. Instead, it had tightened. People began to talk not about revenge, but about boundaries. About what would and would not be tolerated anymore. About how public disrespect, especially in front of hundreds, wasn't just an insult to one man. It was an insult to everyone watching. That understanding settled deep. It didn't burn hot. It burned steady. Moretti tried to force normalcy. He showed up where he always had. He ordered drinks louder. He laughed harder. He leaned into his reputation the way men do when they feel it slipping. But reputation only works when it's echoed. Harlem stopped echoing him. The first real crack came when a routine favor failed. A small thing on paper, a big thing in practice. He needed a door opened quickly, something that usually happened without effort. The door stayed closed, not slammed, just unavailable. The explanation was polite, almost apologetic. That politeness frightened him more than anger would have, because politeness meant the decision was already made. He reached out wider, trying to bypass the neighborhood and lean on city connections. The response was slower than he expected. Careful, distant. Men who once returned calls immediately now took time. They asked questions. They avoided committing to anything that would tie them publicly to him. The humiliation had done something else he hadn't planned for. It had made him visible in a way that attracted scrutiny. Bumpy watched from a distance, measuring the effects. He understood momentum. He understood that once fear changes direction, it keeps moving unless something violently stops it. He also understood restraint. Too much pressure, too fast, would alert the system. So he allowed the pressure to remain just uncomfortable enough to be undeniable. Meanwhile, Harlem felt something unfamiliar. Not safety, not victory. Resolve, the kind that comes from choosing not to look away. The neighborhood had watched what happened in that hall. It had decided collectively that it would not pretend it didn't matter. That decision carried weight. Bumpy's silence became its own language. People read it correctly. He wasn't waiting to react. He was letting the city finish what the humiliation started, letting the lesson spread without forcing it, letting Moretti sit inside the consequences of his own performance. By the end of the second week, Moretti understood the truth too late. The city wasn't turning against him because of something Bumpy had said or done publicly. It was turning because of what Bumpy had allowed it to remember. The disrespect, the witnesses, the choice to swallow it in public rather than spill blood. That choice had changed the rules. Moretti still walked free, still had money, still had connections, but something essential was gone. The sense that Harlem was neutral ground. The belief that he could humiliate a man there and walk away unchanged. He had crossed a line that didn't trigger immediate violence, and that made it worse, because now the city was involved, and cities don't forget. As Moretti scrambled to regain control, he didn't realize that the most dangerous part of Bumpy's plan hadn't even begun, the part where humiliation turns into consequence, and consequence arrives without warning. By the time the city noticed something was wrong, it was already too late to stop it. The pressure around Carlo Moretti was no longer coming from Harlem alone. It was coming from places he had always assumed were secure. That's how traps work when they're built correctly. They don't announce themselves. They make the target believe the world is shrinking on its own. Moretti started losing things he couldn't replace with money. Information stopped flowing. Rumors reached him late, if they reached him at all. Deals that used to move smoothly now required extra steps, extra calls, extra reassurances. Each delay chipped away at the authority he depended on. Power doesn't disappear in a dramatic moment. It erodes, quietly. Public humiliation had been the spark, but erosion was the punishment. Bumpy still hadn't surfaced. That absence became unbearable for men who needed something to react to. The city preferred visible enemies. They liked loud criminals who justified action. Bumpy denied them that comfort. He let uncertainty do the work. And uncertainty is poison to systems built on control. Harlem felt it too, even without knowing the details. Patrols adjusted. Certain faces disappeared from familiar corners. The tone shifted, not aggressive, cautious. The system wasn't coming down hard anymore. It was repositioning. That told Bumpy everything he needed to know. He had achieved something rare. He had forced power to look at itself. The humiliation had put everyone on display. Not just Moretti, the men who tolerated him, the structures that enabled him, the silence that protected him. Now that silence was under threat. And silence, when threatened, makes deals. Moretti tried to outrun the consequences. He moved faster, traveled more, trusted fewer people. He became jumpy, short-tempered. The confidence he once wore easily now felt heavy, like something he had to carry consciously. People noticed. Weakness doesn't need explanation. It announces itself through behavior. Bumpy allowed the trap to tighten another notch. Nothing illegal, nothing traceable, just influence aligning in the right direction. People choosing not to help, choosing not to intervene, choosing to let events take their natural course. That course no longer favored Moretti. The city's concern wasn't justice. It never was. It was stability, and Moretti had become unstable. His humiliation of Bumpy had disrupted a balance that kept Harlem predictable. Predictability mattered more than loyalty. Moretti's boldness had crossed from useful into dangerous. That's when the panic set in. Not loud panic. Strategic panic. Meetings held behind closed doors. Conversations phrased carefully. Decisions framed as routine adjustments. The system began planning an exit that wouldn't look like an admission of guilt. That was always the goal. Remove the problem without acknowledging the cause. Harlem watched closely. They saw how quickly power shifted when it felt exposed, how fast men who acted untouchable were suddenly treated as disposable. That lesson mattered. It confirmed what Bumpy had always understood. Power doesn't protect you forever. It protects you until you become inconvenient. Moretti sensed it. He felt the ground moving beneath him, even if he couldn't see the mechanism. He replayed the night of the humiliation again and again, searching for the moment he should have stopped. He realized too late that the real insult hadn't been the folded bill. It had been forcing Bumpy to decide. And once Bumpy decided, the outcome stopped being about emotion. It became procedural, step by step, influence by influence. No violence required. By the end of the month, Moretti's name carried a different weight. It no longer opened doors. It raised concerns. It triggered caution. Men stopped tying themselves to him publicly. That was the beginning of the end, even if it didn't look like it yet. Bumpy finally appeared in public again, briefly. Just long enough to be seen. Just long enough for Harlem to understand something important. He hadn't lost control. He had redistributed it. The humiliation that was meant to reduce him had done the opposite. It had exposed a weakness in the system itself, a place where pressure could be applied without blood, without chaos, without giving the city an excuse to strike back. Moretti didn't know it yet, but the decision had already been made. Not to punish him, loudly, to remove him quietly. The final move wouldn't come with headlines or handcuffs. It would come as a routine change that erased Moretti's power overnight and left him realizing, too late, that humiliating Bumpy Johnson had rewritten his future. Months passed, and on the surface, the city looked the same. Traffic moved. Music spilled from windows. Men argued over cards. Women carried groceries home like they always had. If someone didn't know where to look, they would believe nothing important had happened at all. That was the city's favorite illusion that time erases meaning. Harlem knew better. Because what happened to Carlo Moretti after the humiliation was not loud enough to be called justice. It was not clean enough to be called closure. It was something more unsettling. It was disappearance without vanishing. A life still breathing, still moving, but stripped of weight. Moretti was reassigned quietly. No headlines, no arrests. Just a shift that sounded administrative on paper and felt devastating in reality. He was moved away from the rooms where decisions were made, away from the neighborhoods where his name had once carried authority, away from the leverage that made his confidence possible. The city framed it as routine. Harlem understood it as exile. That difference mattered. Bumpy Johnson never claimed victory. He never told his version of the story. He didn't need to. Harlem carried it for him, not as gossip, but as instruction. A lesson passed quietly, block to block, generation to generation. It said that dignity did not come from the city. It came from memory and alignment, from knowing when to stay still and when to let pressure work. Moretti felt that memory everywhere he went, not just in Harlem, but in the way other cities treated him. Stories travel differently when they aren't written down. They move through looks, pauses, invitations that never come. Men like Moretti depend on rooms opening for them. Once rooms stop opening, the decline is permanent. Harlem, meanwhile, changed in ways outsiders didn't notice. Not safer, not perfect, but more aware. The neighborhood had seen what unity without noise could accomplish. It had seen how power panics when it can't find a villain to punish publicly. It learned that sometimes the strongest response is refusing to give the system the reaction it expects. Women walked with their heads higher. Men paid closer attention. Young people learned that strength didn't always look like anger. Sometimes it looked like patience, like discipline, like letting someone else's arrogance collapse under its own weight. Bumpy returned to his routines. Reading, walking, observing. His life looked unchanged, but his reputation had deepened. People no longer spoke about him as a man who could explode. They spoke about him as a man who could end things without raising his voice. That kind of reputation lasts longer than fear. Years later, people would argue about what really happened after that night. Some said Moretti lost favor because he overreached. Others said the city simply adjusted. A few whispered that Bumpy had done something behind the scenes that no one could prove. All of them missed the point. The real outcome wasn't what happened to one Italian mob boss. It was what didn't happen to Harlem. That memory became a warning, not written anywhere official, not spoken loudly, but understood. It told men with power that humiliation is dangerous when witnesses are paying attention, that public disrespect creates debts that don't expire, and that some neighborhoods don't need permission to protect their dignity. Moretti lived the rest of his life knowing exactly where he went wrong. Not when he adjusted Bumpy's suit, not when he placed the folded bill, but when he assumed silence meant surrender. He never understood that silence, in Harlem, often meant preparation. Bumpy understood it perfectly. That night, he swallowed humiliation in front of hundreds, not because he was weak, but because he was patient. And patience, when paired with memory, is more destructive than rage. Harlem never forgot that lesson, and long after names faded and stories blurred, the truth remained sharp. You can humiliate a man in public. You can walk away smiling. But if you do it in front of a neighborhood that remembers, what happens next will change your life in ways no apology can fix. And the most unsettling part is this: the city never admitted it happened, but everyone who mattered learned exactly what not to do again.